Everyone has heard of Auschwitz, the infamous concentration camp and factory of death, known for its gas chambers and burning ovens. But what we're about to share goes far beyond just the systematic mass murder. Auschwitz wasn't just about the sheer number of people killed. It was a place of immense suffering and pain. It was a place where torture was not just allowed, but actually encouraged by those in charge. Auschwitz was not simply a prison. It was a laboratory of torment run by sadistic guards in uniform and by fellow prisoners who had been turned into monsters. Dehumanization, sadistic games, brutal medical experiments, and standing cells where prisoners were forced to stand for hours, even days, with no food or water. Dogs dragged chained men through the streets, tearing at their flesh. These weren't just rare isolated events. They were daily routines. And just when you think you've seen the worst, you'll learn about a torture device so brutal that even the SS officers denied its existence. You're not ready for this. Auschwitz death camp. Auschwitz, the landmark death camp of Nazi-occupied Europe, was established in 1940, right after Germany conquered Poland. The Nazis chose the site of an old Polish army barracks in the town of Auschwitz, which they renamed to Auschwitz. At first, the camp was used to hold Polish political prisoners. One of the leading Nazi figures, Rudolf Höss, was appointed as the first commandant. His job was to turn the site into a working prison. By the spring of 1941, the camp housed about 11,000 prisoners, most of them Polish. Then, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the number of prisoners increased rapidly. By the end of the year, Soviet prisoners of war were brought to the camp, and the population reached around 18,000. This original site became known as Auschwitz the Fairs. It was recognizable by a large iron entrance gate with the words Arbeit macht, frei, meaning work will set you free. Yet Auschwitz quickly became anything but a work camp. Inside, prisoners were starved, tortured, and worn out to death. Although not yet an official death camp, it hinted at the grim transformation that was soon to come. On September 3, 1941, the Nazis conducted the first mass killing using Zyklon B gas in the basement of the notorious Block 11 at Auschwitz. This gas had been used in the camp for killing lice, but the Nazis now wanted to test its effectiveness against humans. Approximately 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick Polish inmates were murdered during this operation. This event marked the start of the use of gas chambers for mass murder at Auschwitz. Since the number of prisoners was increasing each month, the Nazis decided to start building a new camp, Auschwitz II, also known as Birkenau. The camp was built by Soviet POWs about 2 miles from the original camp on the site of a former Polish village. The Germans evicted the residents and destroyed most of the buildings. Alongside Auschwitz and Auschwitz II, there was also a third camp, Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz. This was a slave labor camp designed to provide workers to nearby factories. Although not a death camp, conditions within Auschwitz III were so harsh that many prisoners never survived. In contrast, Auschwitz II was built to hold far more people. It was part of what the Nazis called the final solution, a plan to systematically exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. This genocidal policy was formalized at the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, and envisioned the elimination of millions through mass shootings and gas chambers in extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. Indeed, as soon as the Wannsee Conference ended, Auschwitz II began to receive its first transports of Jews from across occupied Europe. Many of the newly arrived prisoners were killed the moment they arrived at the camp. Selections were made on the train platform. The elderly, children, and the sick were sent straight to the gas chambers. At first, gas chambers were located in old farmhouses. Bunker 1, the Little Red House, and Bunker 2, the Little White House, were used for this purpose. Since the camp had no ovens at the time, bodies were burned in open pits, a slow and inhumane process. To improve the efficiency of the extermination process, in 1943, the Nazis built 4 crematoria buildings that combined gas chambers with cremation ovens. The design made the extermination process faster, as these facilities could kill up to 4,400 people a day. As a further improvement to the efficiency of the death factory, a railway line was extended into the middle of Birkenau to handle the large numbers of incoming transports. It is estimated that over 1.1 million people were killed at Auschwitz. Most of them were Jews, But among the victims were also Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others labeled as enemies of the Nazi regime. The mass extermination lasted until the very end. In late 1944, as the Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the Nazis began to erase all traces of their crimes. Himmler ordered the destruction of all the gas chambers and crematoria except for Crematorium 5, which was used until the very end. When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, there were around 8,000 prisoners that the Nazis failed to eliminate. The rest were either killed or moved to other camps. These survivors lived to tell the world of one of the greatest horrors in human history, the unspeakable testimonies of the torture and suffering endured by Auschwitz victims. Dehumanization, torture. In Auschwitz took many forms and exceeded even the darkest limits of imagination. It affected every prisoner without exception. Its purpose was not merely to punish or cause pain, but to erase the very notion that the victims were human beings. This lesson was taught the moment prisoners arrived at the camp. It was the first form of torture they endured, and it continued throughout their entire imprisonment. Dehumanization. Arriving at the camp. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, prisoners were dragged from the train cars by force. Many of them had traveled for days without food. Everyone has heard of Auschwitz, the infamous concentration camp and factory of death, known for its gas chambers and burning ovens. But what we're about to share goes far beyond just the systematic mass murder. Auschwitz wasn't just about the sheer number of people killed. It was a place of immense suffering and pain. It was a place where torture was not just allowed, but actually encouraged by those in charge. Auschwitz was not simply a prison. It was a laboratory of torment run by sadistic guards in uniform and by fellow prisoners who had been turned into monsters. Dehumanization, sadistic games, brutal medical experiments, and standing cells where prisoners were forced to stand for hours, even days, with no food or water. Dogs dragged chained men through the streets, tearing at their flesh. These weren't just rare isolated events. They were daily routines. And just when you think you've seen the worst, you'll learn about a torture device so brutal that even the SS officers denied its existence. You're not ready for this. Auschwitz death camp. Auschwitz, the landmark death camp of Nazi-occupied Europe, was established in 1940, right after Germany conquered Poland. The Nazis chose the site of an old Polish army barracks in the town of Auschwitz, which they renamed to Auschwitz. At first, the camp was used to hold Polish political prisoners. One of the leading Nazi figures, Rudolf Höss, was appointed as the first commandant. His job was to turn the site into a working prison. By the spring of 1941, the camp housed about 11,000 prisoners, most of them Polish. Then, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the number of prisoners increased rapidly. By the end of the year, Soviet prisoners of war were brought to the camp, and the population reached around 18,000. This original site became known as Auschwitz the Fairs. It was recognizable by a large iron entrance gate with the words Arbeit macht, frei, meaning work will set you free. Yet Auschwitz quickly became anything but a work camp. Inside, prisoners were starved, tortured, and worn out to death. Although not yet an official death camp, it hinted at the grim transformation that was soon to come. On September 3, 1941, the Nazis conducted the first mass killing using Zyklon B gas in the basement of the notorious Block 11 at Auschwitz. This gas had been used in the camp for killing lice, but the Nazis now wanted to test its effectiveness against humans. Approximately 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick Polish inmates were murdered during this operation. This event marked the start of the use of gas chambers for mass murder at Auschwitz. Since the number of prisoners was increasing each month, the Nazis decided to start building a new camp, Auschwitz II, also known as Birkenau. The camp was built by Soviet POWs about 2 miles from the original camp on the site of a former Polish village. The Germans evicted the residents and destroyed most of the buildings. Alongside Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, there was also a third camp, Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz. This was a slave labor camp designed to provide workers to nearby factories. Although not a death camp, conditions within Auschwitz III were so harsh that many prisoners never survived. In contrast, Auschwitz II was built to hold far more people. It was part of what the Nazis called the final solution, a plan to systematically exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. This genocidal policy was formalized at the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, and envisioned the elimination of millions through mass shootings and gas chambers in extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. Indeed, as soon as the Wannsee Conference ended, Auschwitz-Birkenau began to receive its first transports of Jews from across occupied Europe. Many of the newly arrived prisoners were killed the moment they arrived at the camp. Selections were made on the train platform. The elderly, children, and the sick were sent straight to the gas chambers. At first, gas chambers were located in old farmhouses. Bunker 1, the Little Red House, and Bunker 2, the Little White House, were used for this purpose. Since the camp had no ovens at the time, bodies were burned in open pits, a slow and inhumane process. To improve the efficiency of the extermination process, in 1943, the Nazis built 4 crematoria buildings that combined gas chambers with cremation ovens. The design made the extermination process faster, as these facilities could kill up to 4,400 people a day. As a further improvement to the efficiency of the death factory, a railway line was extended into the middle of Birkenau to handle the large numbers of incoming transports. It is estimated that over 1.1 million people were killed at Auschwitz. Most of them were Jews, but among the victims were also Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others labeled as enemies of the Nazi regime. The mass extermination lasted until the very end. In late 1944, as the Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the Nazis began to erase all traces of their crimes. Himmler ordered the destruction of all the gas chambers and crematoria except for Crematorium 5, which was used until the very end. When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, there were around 8,000 prisoners that the Nazis failed to eliminate. The rest were either killed or moved to other camps. These survivors lived to tell the world of one of the greatest horrors in human history, the unspeakable testimonies of the torture and suffering endured by Auschwitz victims. Dehumanization, torture, in Auschwitz took many forms and exceeded even the darkest limits of imagination. It affected every prisoner without exception. Its purpose was not merely to punish or cause pain, but to erase the very notion that the victims were human beings. This lesson was taught the moment prisoners arrived at the camp. It was the first form of torture they endured, and it continued throughout their entire imprisonment. Dehumanization. Arriving at the camp. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, prisoners were dragged from the train cars by force. Many of them had traveled for days without food. To terrify the prisoners, the guards often carried out public hangings, which everyone was forced to witness. Inmates were made to stand in rows as the gallows were prepared. A loudspeaker announced the crime and the sentence. There was no one who was exempt from this punishment. Even children were not spared. Victims were dragged to the gallows with ropes around their necks. The prisoners were made to watch the entire process. They had to see their family and friends fall through the trapdoor and hear the sound of their last breaths. On one occasion, the guards organized a special celebration for the Jewish inmates during the holiday known as the Festival of Lights. It was customary for Jews to light a menorah, a 9-branched candelabrum. But instead of candles, the guards used the bodies of 9 dead men, hanging them on poles. They then forced the prisoners to anoint the corpses with oil and set them on fire. As the bodies burned in the night, the prisoners were made to sing Christmas songs instead of Jewish prayers. Physical torture was also a common method used to punish the prisoners. It was only a matter of time before someone would be a direct victim of this torture. Although constant dehumanization was making a lasting impact on prisoners' mental health, it was the physical torture that left them with visible scars. These scars would stay with them for the rest of their lives if they survived the torture. One of the most common forms of torture was suspension by the arms. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and then the body was lifted off the ground. In this way, the prisoner's entire weight was hung from their shoulders. Their arms were twisted backward, causing the joints to pop and the elbows to dislocate. It was not uncommon for the shoulders to be completely torn out during the process. The pain caused by this form of torture was unbearable. Victims screamed in agony until they lost consciousness. Still, the guards left them hanging for hours. Some were taken down only to be hanged again the next day. This left them crippled for life. Many survivors who were tortured in this manner never regained the use of their arms. The worst part was that this punishment was given for small offenses, such as stealing a turnip, talking back, or being slow during roll call. This was why guards used this method often. And because it was not as messy as other methods, it left no blood, but the damage was deep. It taught the prisoners that silence, obedience, and invisibility were the only defenses. But sometimes, even that was not enough. Another feared punishment was known as 25 blows. This was one of the most feared forms of torture in Auschwitz. It was used for minor mistakes and was often issued without prior warning. The guard would simply issue a command, take him for 25 blows. The prisoner was brought to the center of the block or work site where a bench or wooden horse was set up. He had to strip off his pants, place his legs in the stocks, and bend over while two guards held his hands. Then the beating began. Guards usually used a thick rubber tunchon or a wooden stick to strike the prisoner's buttocks, back, or thighs with full force. The prisoner was forced to count each blow out loud. 1, 2, 3. If he cried out in pain or lost count, the beating started over. If he passed out, the guards would revive him with water or slaps and resume the torture. The intensity of the pain was almost impossible to describe. The beating would make the skin split open and tear the prisoner's muscles. It was not unusual for prisoners to lose control of their bowels during the punishment, only to the amusement of the guards. Very often, prisoners couldn't walk afterward and had to be carried back by fellow inmates. One inmate said he could not sit for weeks after the beating, while another claimed the blows made him forget where he was. There were no medical checks after the beating, not even a rest. The prisoner was sent back to work the same day. If he collapsed, he was beaten. Again, almost always these beatings were public. All prisoners were forced to watch. The guards claimed it was to teach discipline. In reality, it was to spread terror. The sound of the stick hitting flesh and the prisoners' screams as they counted. The blows echoed across the entire block. Women, too, were punished this way. One female inmate said that the pain of the 25 blows she received stayed with her for years. The variety of torture methods in Auschwitz was proof that the guards actually enjoyed tormenting the prisoners. For many years after the war, psychologists and historians sought to understand how ordinary individuals, such as death camp guards, became perpetrators of extreme cruelty. Many concluded that it was a mix of blind obedience, dehumanization, peer pressure, and ideological indoctrination that enabled guards to commit acts of sadism without remorse. In Auschwitz, SS guards went so far in their sadism that they invented barbaric games aimed at humiliating, torturing, and killing prisoners. One of the most common was the cap game. A guard would walk past a prisoner and knock off his cap. Then, he would pick it up and throw it beyond the marked line into the so-called forbidden zone. This was a strip of land near the camp fence marked by signs and wires. Everyone knew the rule. Crossing the line meant death. The guard would then order the prisoner to fetch the cap. The prisoner hesitated, knowing that stepping into the forbidden zone could be fatal. But disobeying the guard also meant punishment. That could be worse than death. If the prisoner finally stepped forward to pick up the cap, the guard would call an alarm. He would raise his rifle and kill the prisoner with a single shot. The report would note that a prisoner was shot while trying to escape. His body would be left on the ground as a warning. Such a sadistic game was a routine. The guards treated it like a sport and enjoyed it. Sometimes a guard would toss several caps into the zone and call more than one prisoner. The men looked at each other, unsure who should move first. One always stepped forward. One always died, tortured by dogs. One thing that prisoners feared more than guards' guns was their dogs. These large, powerful animals, usually German shepherds, were trained to attack without hesitation. A single word or a signal from the guard was enough. The guards needed no special reason to set the dogs on inmates. One common practice was chaining 2 or more prisoners together. Then the guards released the dogs. The animals jumped at the prisoners, biting into their arms, legs, and faces. The chained prisoners could not escape. They tried to twist away, but the chain held them tight. The guards stood nearby and watched. They laughed as the dogs tore into flesh. Prisoners screamed, fell, or tried to cover each other. One survivor recalled how the guards used this torture to punish entire groups. If one man in the group made a mistake, all were chained and lined up. A couple of guards would gather and release their dogs upon them. They competed to see whose dog caused more damage. In the end, prisoners were left with deep wounds that could never heal properly in camp conditions. Many died from blood loss or infection only a day after. Those who were lucky to survive this torture carried bite marks for life. The trauma stayed with them. The barking of dogs filled them with fear even years after liberation. One survivor said he could hear the barking in his dreams decades after the war was gone. This was how the monsters from Auschwitz turned dogs, man's best friend, into instruments of torture. And it was all part of the system. Strangulation, drowning, suffocation. Among these monsters, some stood out for their exceptional cruelty. Before the war, Oswald Kaduk was a butcher from Königshuta, Upper Silesia. Working in a municipal slaughterhouse and as a firefighter, he joined the Allgemeine SS in 1939 and was drafted into the Waffen-SS in 1940. After serving on the Eastern Front, illness led to his transfer to Auschwitz in 1941. There, he rose through the ranks from guard duties to Blockführer and eventually Rapportführer, responsible for roll calls and disciplinary measures. Kaduk became notorious as one of the camp's most brutal guards. He was known to personally administer lethal phenol injections into children's hearts just moments after handing them balloons. Prisoners feared him so much that they avoided even looking in his direction. He would kill prisoners without any reason whatsoever. He used his hands or simple tools. One survivor described him as walking into a room, picking someone out, and killing them on the spot. He was also seen placing a blanket over a prisoner's face and sitting on top of them. The victim had no chance to fight back. He would also drown prisoners by forcing their heads under water until they stopped moving. Sometimes he did this in tubs or barrels. Kaduk enjoyed suffocating prisoners. One of his methods involved using a wet blanket. He placed it over the prisoner's head and pressed down so that the prisoner could not breathe. Some struggled, others passed out quickly. Death followed in silence. He used this method mostly on the sick and elderly. These killings were not part of official orders. Kaduk chose to do them. He enjoyed causing fear and pain. Survivors remembered his face, his voice, and the way he laughed during the murders. After the war, Kaduk was arrested by Soviet authorities. In 1947, a Soviet military tribunal sentenced him to 25 years of hard labor, but he was released in 1956. He then moved to West Berlin, where he worked as a nurse and was nicknamed Papa Kaduk by patients. In 1959, Kaduk was arrested again and became one of the main defendants in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. He was convicted of 10 counts of murder and participation in the collective murder of at least 1,000 people, beatings and abuse by capos. The real tragedy of the Auschwitz camp was that torturers could be found among the prisoners as well. Aside from guards in SS uniforms, prisoners lived in constant fear of their fellow inmates, the capos. These men, former criminals, also held power over life and death. Capos were prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS to oversee forced labor and maintain order in the camp. Capos were often selected from the ranks of criminal or political prisoners and were granted certain privileges such as better food, clothing, and accommodations in exchange for their cooperation. And while some capos used their positions to aid other prisoners, others were notorious for their brutality, often exceeding the cruelty of the SS guards to maintain their status and privileges. This behavior was sometimes driven by self-preservation, as failing to meet the expectations of the SS could result in punishment or even death. Most capos used beatings to maintain order, which was, by the way, a daily reality in Auschwitz. Capos kicked prisoners in the kidneys or the testicles. They used clubs to strike heads, backs, and legs. A simple mistake, like hesitating to obey an order, could trigger a brutal attack. Sometimes there was no reason at all. Violence was random and served as a control. Some capos, however, took torture further. They would take a prisoner and break his legs with a metal bar. Then they would order him to stand and run. When the man failed, he was beaten again for disobeying. Others were made to crawl in circles, and they were slapped and kicked if they moved too slowly. If someone cried out in pain, they were beaten even more. For some of the capos, the violence wasn't just about punishment. It was a form of entertainment. They especially liked showing off in front of the SS guards. They wanted to make sure they wouldn't be replaced by someone else, who might treat them the same way they had treated others, crushing their throats or making them suffer. In a similar way, there were the block elders or block elders who were responsible for keeping order in the barracks. Their job included making sure the prisoners followed daily routines, attended roll calls on time, kept the area clean, and followed the rules. They also had the power to punish prisoners without being told to. One survivor told a story about a block elder who had a very strange habit. He would take a prisoner and place them on the floor face up. Then he would step on the prisoner's throat and apply pressure very slowly and firmly until the person stopped moving. While he did this, he would sit on a stool and eat his meal. The other prisoners had to watch in silence, unable to move or speak, knowing that they might be next. Another block elder had a very cruel way of dealing with prisoners during mealtime. When prisoners lined up for their thin soup, he would pick one out and grab them by the neck, forcing their head into a boiling soup kettle. The prisoner would struggle, but there was no way out. The block elder would hold them down until they stopped moving, then let go, and the next person would take their place. No one could escape this fate. Every prisoner knew there were no rules. Even the food could be dangerous. The block elders and capos made sure that every corner of the camp was filled with fear. Sexual abuse was another cruel part of life in the camp. Life in the camp was a constant mix of humiliation, hard labor, and heavy beatings. There were no exceptions. From children to the elderly, everyone was treated in a cruel and inhumane way. But in the camp, women faced even more dangers. Sexual violence. The SS guards had complete control over prisoners' lives, and as we will soon see, their bodies as well. They could choose any woman and force her into a sexual act. Sometimes this was done in exchange for food, protection, or lighter work. But these deals were never voluntary. Hunger and fear made resistance nearly impossible. Many women gave in, just to survive another day. However, most of them were taken by force. The abuse usually started during the roll call in the women's camp. Guards would use these moments to select women they found attractive. Selections usually happened in the evening. The women were taken to separate rooms or barracks and returned later in silence, terrified, ashamed, and changed forever. As the practice of sexual abuse became more common, the camp officials set up brothels in the camp. These were officially meant for male prisoners, the capos, and the block elders as a reward for good behavior. But the women sent there were prisoners themselves. Some of them volunteered to escape worse conditions, others were forced. Once inside, they were under strict supervision. In addition to sexual abuse, they were also subjected to physical abuse and suffered from repeated infections. Surprisingly, some SS guards formed relationships with female prisoners, especially those who held privileged positions. However, these were not real relationships. The power was always in the guards' favor. If a prisoner refused, they could be punished, transferred to worse work, or even killed. Unfortunately, sexual abuse was only part of the story. Many of the women who were victims of such abuse became pregnant. In these cases, they had no options. Very often, they were killed the moment their pregnancy was discovered. If a woman was allowed to give birth due to the terrible conditions and abuse in the camp, the delivery was usually fatal. The mothers were then separated from their babies. The newborns were not allowed to live. However, the worst fate was faced by pregnant women who were sent to the medical block, where doctors conducted terrible experiments on them and their babies. These experiments almost always led to severe torture and death. Medical experiments. Block 10. This block and others were used for various medical experiments. In Block 10, a brick building, Nazi doctors including Josef Mengele, Karl Klauberg, and H. Schumann carried out some of the most horrifying experiments on prisoners. These doctors were mainly interested in sterilization, reproductive studies, and genetics. The prisoners selected for these experiments were mostly women, but men and children were also used. One of the main doctors in Block 10 was Dr. Karl Klauberg, who was obsessed with finding a cheap and efficient method to sterilize women. His goal was to develop a procedure that could be used on millions of Jewish women to prevent them from having children. His experiments involved injecting harmful substances into the women's reproductive organs. These chemicals were intended to block the fallopian tubes and prevent conception. The injections were extremely painful and often caused severe damage. As a result, many women suffered from infections, internal bleeding, and unbearable pain. Many of them died from the procedures. Those who survived were left infertile and suffered from long-term health problems. Another doctor working in Block 10 was Dr. H. Schumann. He also focused on sterilization, but his method involved using X-rays to target the reproductive organs of both men and women. Prisoners were exposed to high doses of radiation, which caused severe side effects, including burns, ulcers, and various infections. As expected, the prisoners did not receive any proper medical care after the experiments. In many cases, the doctors continued the radiation treatments until the patient died. The body was then sent to the crematorium, and a new prisoner was brought in to take their place and continue the experiment. After the war, Dr. Karl Klauberg was captured by the Soviet forces in 1948. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his sterilization experiments at Auschwitz. Was released 7 years later as part of a German-Soviet agreement for repatriation. After returning to West Germany, he continued his medical practice and openly discussed his experiments, which caused great anger among the German public. Dr. Horst Schumann was also captured but by American forces. However, he was released in 1946 and later worked as a sports doctor. When he was exposed in 1951, Schumann went into exile. He was eventually extradited to West Germany in 1966. His trial began in 1970 but was suspended due to his health conditions. He was released in 1972 and died in 1983. Neither of these two doctors, who were responsible for some of the most horrifying acts, faced true justice for the crimes they committed. Their methods included lethal injections and other cruel procedures. The atrocities carried out by the doctors of Block 10 went far beyond just inhumane medical experiments. These individuals, who had once sworn to help others, were directly involved in the mass murder of prisoners. They were an essential part of the Auschwitz extermination system. While the guards used gas, rifles, and beatings to kill prisoners, the doctors used their medical knowledge to carry out executions. They killed prisoners by injecting substances such as phenol, gasoline, or air directly into their bodies. These injections were typically given in the chest or arm. The goal was to kill quickly and quietly. Doctors and their medical staff used this method especially on prisoners who were sick, weak, or no longer able to work. One witness described the process as Abritzen, which means injection in German. Victims were brought into a room, often the infirmary or a separate block. They were told they were getting treatment. Instead, they were injected with a fatal dose. Death came in seconds or minutes. Some victims gasped or convulsed. Others died silently. The bodies were quickly removed and taken to the crematorium. The killings were carried out by doctors and their medical staff. They did it without hesitation, as if it were part of normal duties. In some cases, injections were given one after another without stopping. Witnesses recalled seeing rows of bodies after the procedure. One man said he saw a pile of naked corpses stacked outside the injection room. The process became mechanical. There was no paperwork. The goal was to make the extermination efficient. Since many of the victims were never registered, the SS was able to cover up the killings. This way, thousands of victims disappeared without a trace. No one ever knew what happened to them. This method was used regularly. Hundreds of people were killed this way. Not even children were spared. In one case, 2 train transports arrived from the town of Zamość in Poland. The children brought were boys between 13 and 15 years old. At least 60 of them were killed in one day using phenol injections. A survivor remembered how the boys were lined up, taken in groups, and never returned. Anyone who could no longer serve the camp was a candidate for a lethal injection. They were fast, silent, and left little evidence. The method reflected the cold, systematic approach to mass murder in the camp. Josef Mengele, Block 10, the hospital from hell, was however by far best known for the wicked experiments of Dr. Josef Mengele. A well-educated and respected academic before the war, Dr. Mengele arrived in Auschwitz with a fascination for twins. He believed they held the key to understanding heredity, knowledge he hoped would serve the Nazi goal of expanding the Aryan race. However, his methods in Auschwitz were all but scientific. They were brutal. As soon as a transport arrived, the twins were separated from the crowd. They were given better food and medical attention, but only to keep them alive for experiments. Mengele conducted daily medical procedures on them, including frequent blood withdrawals, painful injections, and comparative surgeries. When the research stage ended, they were killed at the same time. Another group targeted for experimentation were dwarfs, hunchbacks, and people with congenital deformities. These individuals were also separated during selection and placed under special observation. Mengele wanted to discover what caused their abnormalities. Mengele's staff performed full autopsies on their bodies, including a detailed examination of bones, organs, and tissues. They removed spinal cords and preserved skeletons, which were later sent to SS institutes for study. Children and adolescents with a disease called dry gangrene of the face were also studied. It began with a reddish spot near the mouth and soon spread to destroy the cheeks and nose. The disease was common in the gypsy camp, especially among children with hereditary syphilis. Victims were used for live observation and post-mortem analysis. Treatments involving malaria injections and toxic arsenic-based drugs were tested on them. Most died in agony, and their disfigured corpses were sent to dissection. Mengele's obsession with eye color led to another line of cruelty. Prisoners had chemicals injected directly into their eyes in an attempt to make them blue. The procedures caused excruciating pain, blindness, and permanent damage. Mengele also took part in sterilization experiments much like those of Dr. Karl Klauberg, but his approach differed. He focused on preventing reproduction among groups labeled undesirable by the Nazi regime: Jews, Roma, and others, not even pregnant. Women were spared. They were examined, then sent to the gas chambers only so that their corpses could be brought back to the dissection room. It was a complete disregard for human life. Inside his lab, the atmosphere was one of constant fear. Mengele could appear kind, even gentle, only moments before ordering a prisoner's death. He was unpredictable, and that made him even more terrifying. Contrary to his claims, there was no scientific merit in his work whatsoever. It was driven by racist ideology and a desire to shape the world according to Nazi fantasy. Unfortunately, Dr. Josef Mengele, or the Angel of Death as he was called, managed to evade justice for the remainder of his life. In the immediate aftermath of Mengele was briefly detained by the U.S. military, but was eventually released because he couldn't provide proper identification. He had managed to avoid getting a tattoo of the SS, which was an important mark for members of the Nazi regime. By using false names and identities, Mengele worked on a farm in Germany before escaping to South America in 1949. He found support from a group of former SS members already living in the region. Initially, he settled in Argentina, but later moved to Paraguay and eventually found a new home in Brazil after Adolf Eichmann, another former SS member, was captured in 1960. Mengele lived a free life until he passed away from a stroke in 1979, torture, in Block 11. After hearing so much about the various methods of torture used in Auschwitz, it's still hard to believe that there was one place that even the prisoners feared more than any other. That place was Block 11, known as the Camp Jail. It was located inside Auschwitz and was feared by every prisoner. It was situated near the infamous Black Wall and served as a location for torture, starvation, and even executions. The most dreadful chambers were in the basement. These cells were referred to as the standing cells by the prisoners. They were small brick rooms, no more than 90 by 90 centimeters in size. 4 prisoners would be forced inside through a tiny door at floor level. Once inside, they could only stand. There was no space to sit or lie down. The air was very stale and limited. There was a small opening that let in some fresh air, but not enough to make the place bearable. Because they were kept upright, the prisoners could barely sleep. They could only lean against each other to rest. If one fell unconscious, they would collapse onto the others. There was also no room to go to the bathroom. So, they had to relieve themselves right where they stood. Over time, the cell floors became soaked with urine and feces, so the prisoners had to stand in their own waste up to their waists. With little or no ventilation, the stench was nearly unbearable. The prisoners were locked in these cells overnight, after a long day of forced labor. They received neither food nor water. After standing all night in such discomfort, they were forced back to work. This process continued for days, sometimes even weeks. The intention was to break them down both, physically and mentally. One prisoner later recalled that being sent to the bunker was worse than being beaten. He said that at least a beating ended. In the bunker there was no end. Time seemed to stop. He described the sound of men groaning in the dark, whispering, prayers or begging for water that never came as one of the worst experiences of his life. However, Block 11 was not just about the standing cells. It also contained cells used for questioning under torture. In some of these cells, prisoners were tied to iron bars and whipped. Others were stripped and forced to kneel motionless on gravel for extended periods. Every time a guard passed by, they would add to the suffering at their own discretion. But the worst of all was the cell where a special torture device was installed, the so-called Boger swing. It was known as the Boger swing or Boger shackle. This device was made by SS officer Wilhelm Boer. It consisted of a wooden beam placed on two iron trestles. Prisoners were tied to it with their arms and legs bound. Their hands were cuffed over their knees, and a stick was passed under the knees and over the elbows, locking them into a tight, immobile position. The beam was then pulled up so the prisoner hung in the air upside down, with the weight of their body pressing heavily against their joints. Once in this position, the prisoner was beaten repeatedly. Boger or another SS officer would use sticks, clubs, or whips. These beatings often lasted for hours. Witnesses reported that the victims screamed until they lost consciousness. The officers would wake them up with water and continue the beating. After the torture, the prisoners were dragged back to their cells, bleeding and broken. The beatings on the Boger swing caused severe bruising, broken bones, and internal injuries. It wasn't uncommon for prisoners to die during the process. One former prisoner described seeing people come back from the Boger swing with their faces swollen, eyes closed, and bodies soaked in blood. He said they looked like they had been attacked by wild animals. Another survivor shared a story about a man who returned unable to walk or speak. His hands were paralyzed, and he could not lift his head. The Boger swing was mainly used during interrogations. Prisoners were often tortured to extract information or force confessions, even though many had nothing to confess. The goal was to break them down. The torture was intended to cause maximum physical and mental pain. Boer was known to take pleasure in the process. He would swing the beam back and forth while the beatings continued. After all, it was one of his own inventions. It was so brutal that even some of his fellow officers later denied knowing about it. Like most SS officers, Wilhelm Boer escaped Auschwitz just a couple of days before the camp was liberated. He left his brutal invention behind. When the war ended, he simply disappeared. Boer lived in hiding for years until he was finally discovered and arrested in 1959. 6 years later, he was brought to court as part of the famous Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. The key witness was Frau Braun, Boer's personal secretary, who fled Germany after the war. Without her testimony, the world might never have learned about the most brutal torture device in Auschwitz. Her description of the process was chilling. A prisoner would be brought in for questioning, stripped naked, and made to bend over the bar. Their wrists were manacled to their ankles. A guard on one side would push them off across the chamber in a long, slow arc, while Boer would ask questions, first quietly and then more aggressively, and finally in a loud bellow. At each return, another guard would be present. Equipped with a crowbar, the tormentor would strike the victim forcefully across the buttocks. As the relentless swinging continued, the victim would scream in agony, fainting briefly only to wake up again, howling in pain. The attacks persisted, without pause, until what remained was a grotesque mass of bloodied, mangled flesh hanging before their eyes. Most of the victims succumbed to their suffering, some quickly, others after a long and agonizing struggle. In the end, all that was left was a pile of bones, raw skin, and fat, dragged away from the grim scene left on the concrete floor. The Boger swing was a stark symbol of the extreme cruelty that lay within Auschwitz, a terror that prisoners dreaded more than death itself. As we conclude this harrowing journey through history, we understand that Auschwitz was engineered to destroy, but only after it had shattered the bodies, minds, and dignity of those who were subjected to it. In this place, torture was not an occasional act, it was the norm, and its sole objective was to crush the human spirit completely, leaving nothing but broken remnants behind. Today, we must take heed of this dark chapter and remember the atrocities committed in the name of ideology, blind obedience, and hatred. Thank you for watching.